calls us to awaken him. How will he find us when he comes?
Awake and ready.
And when he asks us to dedicate ourselves ever more perfectly to him, how will he find us?
Awake and ready.
Heavenly Father,
Heavenly Father,
Divine Mother,
Divine Mother,
Friend, beloved God,
Friend, beloved God,
Great Masters,
Great Masters,
Jesus Christ,
Jesus Christ,
Babaji Krishna,
Babaji Krishna,
Lahiri Mahashaya,
Lahiri Mahashaya,
Swami Shri Yukteswar,
Swami Shri Yukteswar,
Paramahansa Yogananda,
Paramahansa Yogananda,
Saints of all religions,
Saints of all religions,
we humbly bow to you all.
we humbly bow to you all.
Give us thyself, Mother,
Give us thyself, Mother,
that we may give thee to all,
that we may give thee to all.
naughty or good.
Naughty or good,
We are thy children.
we are thy children.
Bring us home to thee
Bring us home to thee.
in this lifetime.
In this lifetime.
Om.
Om.
Peace.
Peace.
Amen. Please have a seat. We'll have some music.
Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Oh, my saint, you did not meditate, you did not concentrate, you did not meditate, you did not concentrate, and pass the time in idle words. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Death will be at thy door, and you may not have time anymore. Deathbed will be at thy door, and you may not have time anymore to redeem my soul. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake. Oh, my saint, wake yet wake.
Let's continue to meditate as we listen to these words from Affirmations for Self-Healing on our quality this week. Wisdom. We often hear the expression, sadder but wiser. This is the mark of worldly wisdom, which people equate with disillusionment. Indeed, worldly hopes sooner or later all end in disappointment, and sometimes in great sorrow. Worldly wisdom often wears the garb of sadness. Not so divine wisdom. On the spiritual path, the expression should be happier and wiser. For true wisdom means recognizing at last the pathway out of delusion and toward the light of truth. Divine wisdom is omniscience itself. In such wisdom, there is no shadow of sorrow, only bliss absolute, bliss infinite, bliss eternal. Let's affirm together. As I learn the lessons that life teaches me,
As I learn the lessons that life teaches me,
I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom.
I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom.
As I learn the lessons that life teaches me,
As I learn the lessons that life teaches me,
I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom.
I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom.
Softer now, as I grow the lessons that life teaches me, I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom. And now in a whisper, as I learn the lessons that life teaches me, I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom. Now mentally, as I learn the lessons that life teaches me, I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom. And broadcasting from the superconscious center, the spiritual eye, as I learn the lessons that life teaches me, I grow toward ever greater joy and freedom. Pray silently with me. I am grateful, Lord, for every test you send me. Each time I stumble, help me to learn. Each time my human weakness makes me fall, help me to grow stronger. May I realize behind every pain thy calm, reassuring wisdom. Om. Peace. Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
Good to see you all, and welcome to our friends online. I think everyone knows this, but in case someone doesn't, I'm Narayan, my wife Dharmadevi, and a joy to share with you Rays of the One Light. These are weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. And this is week 37. Truth invites, it never commands. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. Should just stop at that every week. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Free will is a basic principle of life. God never coerces. He invites us to live in such a way that we find fulfillment in ourselves. If we refuse to live rightly, Paramahansa Yogananda taught, God simply says, I will wait. We have eternity to live. In that eternity, we live as we choose. In self-created darkness, a darkness as intense and as long-lasting as we choose, or in the infinite light, the true self, which is God. Jesus Christ in the Beatitudes offered a beautiful example of God's way of inviting mankind to seek perfection, not by commanding, but by offering his human children the incentive they need to choose the right of their own volition. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus said, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. In each of the Beatitudes, Jesus explains the blessing attendant upon observing it. The divine way, similarly, for each of us is not to do violence to our own natures. Spirituality must be attained naturally. It can never be attained by force. The Bhagavad Gita says in the 3rd chapter, even the wise behave in accordance with nature as it is manifested in them. Of what avail then is suppression? The scripture then goes on, however, to explain that this doesn't mean we should surrender to the dictates of our lower nature. Rather, it emphasizes our need to aspire to the heights. But each of us, in accordance with his own nature, and not in imitation of anyone else's, offering ourselves up for purification by divine grace. Desire, whatever form it takes, so the Bhagavad Gita explains, should be resisted, even if only mentally. Attachment and repulsion to sense objects, both of these are universally rooted. No one should accept their influence, for verily they are man's enemies. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om. Om. Om.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to start by reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is the demand to the Holy Trinity. O Heavenly Trinity, Om Tat Sat, God the Transcendent Father, God the Immanent Christ Consciousness, and God the Holy Creative Vibratory Force of all creation, grant me the wisdom to know Thy truth through my self-effort and my knowing acceptance of the law. Help me up the golden ladder of realization to stand at last on the shining summit of attainment, face to face with the one Spirit, perfect, everlasting bliss. In our meditation practice, we learn a lot about developing intuition. That's one of the most important things that we learn about on the spiritual path. And this morning, during the purification ceremony, I was somewhat regretting Narayan's increased intuition because he tapped into a thought that I had and shared the story of St. Francis and his disciple Bernard. So not all of you were there for it. Maybe you know this story, a beautiful story of Bernard who was following St. Francis but was a little skeptical. He had a little bit of unsurety of Francis's sanctity. And so Francis stayed the night at his home, and Bernard was trying to stay up to see what Francis would do. And Francis pretended to be asleep. I think he was snoring loudly. And so Bernard pretended to be asleep also and started snoring loudly. And so Francis, though knowing that Bernard was actually still awake, quietly got down at the bed and began to pray quietly, "My Lord, my God, my all," whispering this prayer with more and more intensity, very quietly. And then Bernard very quietly got down off of his bed and started to pray very quietly and intensely, "My Lord, my God, my all." And this story, though, is so beautifully connected with this reading of truth, inviting rather than commanding. Francis didn't say to Bernard, "Well, if you want to be a good disciple, you need to pray, and you need to pray with more intensity. You're not praying more intensely enough, and what are you doing? Get down here and pray with me, stay up all night. It's the only way you're going to get there." He just very quietly, very humbly was a perfect example of pure discipleship. And this is why I left the altar up here with Swami Kriyananda's items. We celebrated his anniversary of his discipleship on Wednesday, September 12th. And really, Swamiji embodied this example of inviting. He said it was an invitation through inspiration. He never commanded anyone to do anything, but he would invite through his example. And he would say many times, it was interesting when you would hear Swami give a talk, especially in his later life. They have many amazing talks of Swamiji in his younger years where he would share just hours of these yogic truths and principles, and going into very esoteric and very deep truths. And then towards the end of his life, the stories got less and less, where we would hear the same stories every week. And he would share often about what he had done in life. And to the outside ear, meaning those who weren't really interested in what he had to offer, like news reporters, for example, they would hear him saying, I wrote 150 books, I started 10 communities around the world, I composed 400 pieces of music, I wrote screenplays, and they're going like, God, this guy sounds kind of egotistical. But the only reason he was saying it was because those things were not possible for a human to do. And he was trying to show us that by tapping into this, what this reading is sharing, God is the doer. That's the only way he could do those things. It's the only way we can do those things. So he was sharing with us, just as St. Francis was sharing very humbly, though in a very different way, right? The humble disciple praying, and the humble disciple saying, look at all these things that can be done when we practice non-attachment, when we see God as the doer. I wanted to share, because yesterday actually we're teaching this Akash series, Ancient Keys to Attaining Success and Happiness, that Swamiji taught when he lived in LA in 2011. And this lesson happened to be this yesterday on non-attachment, and it fits very well with this reading. And specifically, it struck me that in this reading, he says about attachment and repulsion to sense objects. Both of these are universally rooted. No one should accept their influence, for verily they are man's enemies. This is from the Gita. And so we often think of attachments and practicing non-attachment, therefore, as those things that we really want and we really are grasping and trying to hold on to. But here, the Gita, Krishna is sharing with us both attachment, those things that we're trying to draw and hold to ourselves and latch onto, and those things that we're trying very hard to push away. Both are desires, both are two sides of the same coin of attachment. And so sometimes through the practice of non-attachment, we actually have to embrace something and accept it into our lives. Another thing that struck me about this reading was how he's sharing about working with our nature and how important that is. I've had this lingering cold bug thing for the past 2 weeks, and at about the end of week 1, after I had missed last Sunday service and the last Akash class, I was feeling a little grumpy. And so Narayan was bringing me somewhere, I can't remember, but your voice also drops, which helps with the grumpy attitude. And so Narayan is the most positive person I know in the world. And so he was, sometimes the perky positiveness brings out a little bit more of my grouchiness. And so I was at a pretty low point, and so he was saying, "Oh, you're well, you're looking much better." And I was like, not really well. But what was so fun was that then all these sayings of Yogananda's started popping into my mind, and then Narayan got on board with it. And if you've ever heard Yogananda's talks, they're the CDs that SRF puts out, and they're beautiful. And he'll say things like, he said, privation, rising cost, millions die. What fun is there in this world? And so this thought starts popping into my mind. What fun is there in this world? And it was going with that grumpy nature, that grouchiness of what fun is there in this world? It's no fun. We get sick, can't do things that we want to do. And so we started saying a number of these, and then came up with what we called the Grouchy Yogi's Guide to Enlightenment. So you'll get to read about it. Narayan wrote a blog that's really fun. But, we can't suppress. That's what Gita is sharing with us. Krishna is sharing, to what avail is suppression? To just say, oh yeah, I feel fine. I feel good. Everything's great, grand, wonderful. It doesn't, it's just skating along the surface. There's nothing that gets in there and actually connects with your true feeling and actually can shift you. So if you can, though, take whatever mood you're feeling and work with it how it will then open up and allow you to shoot the buckshots of your smiles in there. And actually through just tuning into Master's voice, even though it was, him sharing from Krishna, get away from my ocean of suffering and misery, and I started laughing, and Narayan started laughing, and so we were just more and more. And he would talk about, he said on one of them, you profess your love to your significant other, and you say, I'll love you forever. And he said, and God is laughing with your bones strewn in the moonlight. I was like, I love you, Master. Because, he related to all of us, whether we have an inherently bubbly, positive, enthusiastic nature, or maybe we have a more solemn, more deep, more maybe austere aura about us. But either way, God still offers us, even through one master, and especially through a whole line of masters, offers each one of us a special, unique, creative way to get out of our drama, to get out of our little selves and get into that ocean of beauty and joy. And really, it is an ocean of suffering and misery as long as we're attached to it. As long as we think that this world is going to bring us any kind of happiness, it won't. It will only bring us suffering and misery. And as soon as we know that, though, the world can become beautiful. The world can be a joyful place because we have no attachment to what's this world going to give me. The world's going to give us nothing but sorrow and misery. But when we're attached to the only thing we can actually be attached to, because it's the only thing that will ever, like that chant of Saint Teresa's prayer, that everything changes. God changes not. All things will pass, good and bad. The only thing that won't pass, the only thing changeless, is the divine, is God, and is God within each one of us. We have to remember that too, that there is that individual spark of spirit within us that's just leaping for joy constantly. So I wanted to share, there was one more that I have to share. I don't think it's going to make it onto the blog. But when Yogananda, if you haven't heard these talks, you really should listen to him. His voice just carries so much power and so much joy. But he's talking about the TV. Do you remember this? And he says the TV is the greatest pest of modern man. And then just kind of subtly under his breath, he goes, too much radio. It's like, you hear there's somebody out in the audience that's going like, well, he said TV, maybe too much radio. But anyways, so I wanted to just share with you quickly about non-attachment and just 3 ways that we can practice non-attachment. And one, we covered these in the class yesterday on non-attachment, but this practice that Swami Kriyananda gave of building a bonfire in the mind, at the spiritual eye, seeing that there's this great bonfire there of purifying divine light, and that whatever we feel these attachments to, we can, he said, visualize the heart. And the heart, the center of feeling, is where all these attachments go out from. All these strings of attachments are sometimes very strong ropes and cables and just chains that tie our hearts to these things outside of ourselves, that we feel like we actually take a piece of our joy from inside and we put it on that object or that person or that situation, and we say that, oh look, whenever I think about that, it brings me joy, but it's really just a reflection of the joy that we've put onto it. So we reclaim that joy and say, this joy isn't from anything outside of me, it's just within. And we buff our heart center, cut off the cords, cut the chains, break through all of it, and then buff your heart center like you're buffing a floor at a gym. If you've ever seen the guy going through buffing, waxing the floor, buff your heart center. See it shining and bright and free, that there's nothing holding it back. And then offer all of those attachments, all those strings of attachments into that bonfire at the spiritual eye. This is something that's so powerful to do every single night. And you can go through, if you have that practice of introspection, how did we do today? Did the forces of light win? Did the forces of darkness win? And just throw it all into the fire. Cast all of it into the fire. Another way is to visualize or to imagine the worst thing that could possibly happen. And we've, in a way, been trained not to do this. We think in fear, oh no, if I think about the thing that I fear most, it's going to happen. But is that really creating any less fear? No, don't even think about it. Because as soon as you think about it, it's just going to happen. No. Think about, what is the worst thing that could happen in this situation? Live it. Live through it. And feel, I will be okay. My soul is deathless. It's pure joy. And what will happen if blank? How can I move on? How will I pick up the pieces and be okay? Third thing and final thing is, as I mentioned, to see God as the doer. And I was thinking about this because when you have lived at Ananda village, you get used to people sharing this expression, You give someone a compliment. Oh, that was a beautiful, wow, you sang so beautifully. And, oh, God is the doer. And the very next thing you hear, well, God has to work through channels. And Swami shared about this. He said, don't do that. Let the person say, God is the doer. Accept that reality, because God did do it. God did do it. And feel it for yourself. If someone says, well, God has to work through it, okay. Just accept it and feel God is the doer. God is the doer. And I invite you to pray with me this prayer of St. Francis. We'll do it 3 times together. My Lord, my God, my all. My Lord, my God, my all. My Lord,